Hello, everyone, and welcome to PMP Live. Thank you so much for joining us in this new format where we can continue to bring authors and their new books to the politics and prose community. A few things before we begin. At any time during the event, you can click on the green button below to purchase Kawai's book on Politics and Prose website. And we are currently offering free media mail shipping throughout the US. And your online purchase goes to support a small business at a time when we truly need it the most. And just like in all of our in-person events, you're still able to ask the author a question tonight by clicking on the Ask a Question, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And you can submit your question as well as read others. And you can even vote on the ones you want to hear answered the most. Unlike our in-person events, the author, host, and audience members cannot see you through the screen. So please embrace the comfiness of your home and where you're at. And then also, finally, we want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. As you know, small businesses, especially bookstores, are getting hit especially hard during these uncertain times. But we're dedicated to still bring you the first-class content we're known for. And so thankful to loyal customers like all of you, keeping both our business and spirits afloat. Today, we are very excited to welcome Kawai Strong Washburn, celebrating his debut novel, Sharks in the Time of Saviors. Kawai was born and raised on Hamakua coast of the Big Island on Hawaii. And his work has appeared in The Best American Non-Required Reading, McSweeney's, Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, among many others. And he was a 2015 Tin House Summer Scholar and a 2015 Bread Loaf Work Study Scholar. And we are so excited to have him here tonight. Joining him in conversation with Kawai today is none other than Tommy Orange, the author of the national best-selling and like a list of so many awards that his novel There brought, and is just amazing. So I know this conversation between these two is just going to be beautiful. Kawai is going to start it off reading for a bit, and then they're going to have a conversation. So please join Kawai and Tommy. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you, Alan. I'll just read for a couple of minutes here. I won't read for too long. Thanks for everybody that's here. I know it's strange to be moving into a virtual world for book events, and it would be much nicer if we were all in the same physical space together and kind of had the nice energy that comes with that. But you know, in lieu of having that, it's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. I think right now the count looks like it's 78 people logging on, which is I think a lot more than I would expect to be at a reading in person. Certainly for me, you know, somebody that's relatively unknown. Having said that, I'm going to just read a section from the latter part of the first chapter, just to set the stage really quickly for those of you that are unfamiliar with the work. It's set largely in the Hawaiian Islands as well as on the west coast of the United States. And the family which this story revolves around is struggling through a lot of economic hardship. And this section is from the perspective of the mother, actually. So I'll be speaking in the first person from the perspective of the mother. And they've managed to scrape together a little bit of extra money, and they're using it to take a tour, like a boat cruise, which is something that for a lot of people in the islands is kind of out of their reach. And so this family managed to scrape together just enough money to do that. And so now they're on a short little boat cruise together, trying to enjoy some peace and relief from their otherwise troubling circumstances. So I'll start reading now. So Kailua Kona, Ali'i Drive, small stone walls and swerving sidewalks fronting the scoops of sugary beach and luminous ocean, then all the little storefront tourist traps leading back like breadcrumbs to the beach hotels. Your father and I stood at the Kona dock, each holding a ticket for the boat ride, plus one for each of you kids. And we watched the tide surge and all the clean, glossy boats rock and dip and shine slick with each swell. The pier was long and black-topped and spined with fishing poles, and halfway along the dock's edge, a group of local boys were pitching themselves off into the water, over and over, exploding into the ocean froth of the boy who jumped before, chee-hooing and slapping their wet feet across the wood steps back to the edge. Then we were on our way out away from the dock of Kona, sitting in a plush-jointed couch on the Hawaiian Adventure, a trimaran like the types we always see drifting in the haze of the Kona coast, especially at sunset. Boats with slides off the back and lobster-colored tourists jabbering on the covered decks. But this one had a middle hole with thick glass in the bottom that let us look down into the ocean, and as the engines pushed a mellow vibration again and again across the deck, the water went from something green-blue to a deep, almost purple color, and the coral grew up thick and knotted, in sections stuck out fingers or bloomed brains, and the spiked red fans of sea anemones swaying like the tide was a wind. I could smell the sun, the way it heated the old sea salt on the edges of the boat, and the sharp, too sweet, fruity Malolo syrup in the fruit punch, and the sting of diesel fuels belching from the grinding engines. Mostly we sat inside, all 5 of us in a row right down front in the plush stadium seating, looking through the glass bottom, me telling stories about which animal was which god, how they saved or fought the first Hawaiians, your father cracking jokes about how his Filipino forefathers only eat dogfish or the black fish with long noses, and the sun slanted in under the ceiling and the motor kept churning its hum up through our seats. I was somewhere warm and slow, and Callie was asleep in my arms when I woke without knowing why. You and Dean and your father were gone. In fact, no one was in the viewing cabin. Voices were rising out on the deck. I shifted Callie from my lap, she complained, and I stood. The voices were clipped into basic commands. We're going to make a turn, keep pointing, get the preserver. I remember feeling like the sounds were coming from the other side of a cavern, so far away and cotton stuffed in my head. I grabbed Cowie's hand. She was still rubbing her eyes and complaining, but I was already bringing her with me as I climbed the stairs from the viewing cabin to the sun deck. Impossibly white. I had to shade my eyes and squint so hard I felt my lips and gums lift. People were gathered along the cabled rail of the slick white deck, looking into the ocean, pointing. I remember seeing your father and Dean. They were maybe 30 feet away from me and Cowie, and I was confused because your father was wrestling Dean back from the rail, and Dean was screaming, "Let go, and I can get him." One of the deckhands in a white polo shirt and baseball hat pitched a red life preserver into the air, and it wobbled and wheeled out into the sky with the rope whipping behind. Did I run to your father? Had he pulled Dean off the rail? Was I gripping Cowie's hand so hard it hurt her? I can assume, but I can't remember. I only remember that I was at your father's side then on the blazing white deck, rising and falling with the waves, and our family was there, all except for you. Your head was bobbing like a coconut in the ocean. You were getting smaller and farther away, and the water was hissing and spanking the boat. I don't remember anyone saying much of anything except the captain calling out from upstairs, "Just keep pointing, we're turning, just keep pointing." Your head went under, and the ocean was flat and clean again. There was a song playing from the speakers, a tinny, stupid, sweet Hawaiian cover of More Than Words, which I still can't listen to, even though I liked it once. The engines churned. The captain was talking from the wheel upstairs, asking Terry to keep pointing. Terry was the one who'd thrown the life preserver that was floating empty in the waves, moving away from where I'd seen your head. I was tired of being told to point, being told to wait, so I said something to Terry. He made a face. Then his mouth was moving under his mustache, words back at me. And the captain was calling from above. Your father started in too, all 4 of us saying things. I think I finished talking with something that made Terry start, so that his face flushed around his sunglasses. I saw myself in those mirrored lenses, me darker than I thought I was, which I remember made me happy. And my shoulders from basketball, and that I'd stopped squinting my eyes. Then my feet were up on the railing, and Terry's eyebrows were raised, and he started to open his mouth at me. He reached for me. I think your father did too, but I leapt into the big, empty ocean. I hadn't been swimming long when the sharks passed under me. I remember them first as dark blurs, that the water told me the weight of those animals, a shove of wake against my legs and belly. They passed me, and all 4 of their fins punched the surface, knives on the summit of dark swells, cutting for you. When they reached where your head had been, the sharks dove under. I started to swim after them, but the distance might as well have been to Japan. I dunked once to try and see. Underwater, there was nothing, but a vague darkness and froth where the sharks were. Other dark colors. Pink and chummy ropes rising from the froth. I knew those would be next. I didn't have any more breath. I broke the surface and choked in oxygen. If there were sounds, if I yelled, if the boat was closer, I don't remember. I went back down. The water where you were was all churn. The shapes of the sharks were thrashing, diving, rising, something like a dance. The next time I went for air, you were at the surface, sideways, prone and ragdolling in the mouth of a shark. But the shark was holding you gently, do you understand? It was holding you like you were made of glass, like you were its child. They brought you straight at me, the shark that was holding you, carrying its head up out of the water like a dog. The faces of those things, I won't lie. I shut my eyes as they neared, when I was sure they were coming for me too, and if everyone was yelling and crying out, as I imagined they were, and if I was thinking anything, I don't remember any of that, except the black of my closed eyes and my prayers without a mouth. The sharks never hit. It passed again below me, around me, wake like a strong wind. And then I opened my eyes. You are there at the boat, clutched to a life preserver. Your father reaching down for you. I remember how angry I was at how slow he went, all the time in the world. And I wanted to say, are you a fucking Pauhana County worker? Grab our child, our alive child. And you were coughing, which meant you were breathing, and there was no red cloud in the water. This wasn't just one of those things. Oh, my son, now we know that none of it was. And this was when I started to believe. And I think I'll stop there. That's the end of that section.
Hi, everyone. I don't think there's any in these spaces, non-spaces, virtual spaces. There's no segues or be able way to read the crowd, but I'm sure everyone enjoyed that and was wrapped by it. It's an incredible end to the first chapter of this incredible book. Hi, out there. I'm Tommy Orange. This is all very awkward and the timing's always a little off, and it's already hard to do, but thank you all for coming. If I could wear noise cancellation earphones to every live event, I actually would. This part I like, having the sound closer and the other sounds further. I like that part. Okay, so before we get to the book, thank you for reading that. Let's just talk about a little bit how, just because of this sort of elephant in the room for everyone, everyone very aware of their rooms, probably more than the elephant because of being stuck in them. How has this time changed your life, or maybe how has it not changed your life? Where are we hearing you from right now?
Yeah,
like your room and the place and the state.
Yeah, so I live in Minneapolis. My wife and our children, we live together here. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old daughter, and we live in a house here in Minneapolis. The first, we're fortunate enough that it's the first. I turned 40 in a couple of months, and this is like the first house I've ever owned. Like, I have a mortgage. I had been all through most of my adult life so far. I just assumed I'd never own a house because everywhere I lived, it was way more expensive than I ever thought.
Congratulations.
But this is it. Yeah, thanks, man. This is our house, and so this is the space where I work in my day job. I'm a software engineer. It's also where I write. So this is where the failure happens. Lots of failure with few successes. But yeah, to talk about the question you asked there at the start, I think that more than anything, first of all, sort of seeing the way the coronavirus is spreading, there are so many thoughts I have. One of those is that it's a good reminder of both how fragile the world is and how interconnected it is, and also how fortunate I am and my family is with the fact that right now this is not as big a threat to us as it is to some people, right? We're both fortunate enough to still have jobs and to still know that we have food to put on the table for our family tomorrow and things like that. And so many people, that is just not the case. And I'd like to think that would give us some space to maybe think about how we can change some of the things the way they are in both the States and the world as a whole. The fact that an illness like this can suddenly put so many people in such a precarious position. So I think I start always from a place of great recognition of fortune and privilege that I have to feel any amount of security, however tenuous, in the current situation. And also, I think the other thing is that it reminds me how much I appreciate the connections, like the daily physical and like spatial connections with people. It's really hard to be just locked down in a house. And even when you go out in the street, like you can't, there's this awkward, like, wait, how far apart are we supposed to be? Like, let's keep this conversation short. We don't want to catch, you know, a life-threatening illness from each other. And that is such a hard thing to have, you know, every physical space be this compromised, threatening place now. But I also remind myself that for a lot of people in the world, it's not different than what their daily life has been at different times in their lives. You know, whether we're talking about migrants that are having to flee violent and threatening situations and try to cross through uncharted territories and have to be afraid of interaction with anybody outside of their small groups, or if we're talking about countries that are in the middle of wars that are trying to recover from those. You know, some of the people I know that have spoken the most about what it feels like to live through this are people that have lived through like the Balkans crisis or things like that. And they're like, oh yeah, so when we get out our duct tape and like our bleach to get our water purified and things like that. So, you know, we're just in some ways realizing what it feels like for a lot of people in the world at a lot of other times. So.
Yeah.
How about you? Is it, you know, is it difficult? How does it feel?
It's changed in the sense that I was on the road a lot doing speaking gigs, and now I'm home, and that's been nice. And like you, I just expected to be a lifelong renter, and now own a home, and it's in the mountains. And unlike you, I can go outside and go for runs or walks, and I probably won't see anybody. I'm more afraid to see a wild animal like a bear. I've seen like bear paws prints around here that are pretty big, and so I'm more afraid to see a being than I am, or like, you know, I'm more afraid to see an animal than I am to see a human where I'm running and walking these days. I'm noticing that you're somehow I feel like you're making eye contact with me. I'm having this thing where if I look into the camera, I feel like a psychopath. If I look at myself, I hate doing that. If I'm looking at you, do you feel that I'm looking at you?
Yeah,
Does
I
that
think
feel,
you have to.
I'm looking at your square. Does that feel like I'm looking at you?
No, you're looking slightly off to the side. I think the only way you can make it work is to look at the camera, which is like the worst.
That makes you
I'm
feel like a
just staring
psychopath.
at a glowing dot. Yeah.
Because for a brief second, you can catch yourself looking at yourself. Like there's a brief lag where you can catch yourself looking in the camera, and there's a psychopath moment.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna cover my face with my notes, with my questions. So let's move on. Sorry. Okay, well, I just want to say how much I love this book. The writing is so beautiful and terse and tough, and the story just moves so well throughout. It's totally unputdownable and bright and prismatic, and you know, takes us through sort of the life of a family. Could you just talk about where these voices come from? When did it start? How long did it take to finish this?
Yeah. It's, you know, so probably about 10 or 11 years. No, actually, it's probably 12 years ago. The image of you know, the tail end of that first chapter, a child being gently carried from the water by sharks, was. I don't know exactly where it came from, and it was so long ago that I would just be making up a story if I had any idea of what it was. I just can't remember. But I know the first time the image came to me, I was doing other writing. Maybe I think I had just started thinking seriously about being a writer, but I was writing a bunch of short stories, and the idea of like a shark lifting up a child didn't seem to me at the time like it was necessarily going to lead to any sort of story. But it kept showing up over the course of several months, or you know, maybe even 2 years or something like that. I would just be taking a shower or washing the dishes or going for a run or sitting on a bus or something, and all of a sudden the image would come back, and it kept coming back. So I started asking questions and wondering, well, if this is, you know, who's this child that's being pulled from the water by the sharks, and why are these sharks pulling them from the water? That makes no sense. That's not normally something that sharks do. And so I started asking all those questions, and I would ask some of the questions and then just put the image and the questions back away. And I guess my subconscious kept working on it and wanting to engage with it. And so finally, when I realized it was persistent and the questions started to lead to what I thought were interesting answers, or to interesting further questions. And so I started thinking about a family from there. I was like, well, you know, normally when I think of a child, one of the things I start thinking of is, well, who is this child's family? And that's what I did with this image. And that led to starting to think about, okay, well, here's this family. One of them is in the water being carried out by sharks. What does all of that mean? And it started to dovetail with a lot of things that I had grown up in Hawaii and experienced or had been a part of my upbringing that suddenly became things that might be viable parts of this. And one of those things was the mythology and the traditions of the Native Hawaiian people that are incredibly rich and interesting and are still very much alive today and influence people's, the way they interact with the natural environment. And so some of those things started to dovetail with the questions I was asking about the family and the shark, and it just grew from there. And I started working, once I started asking about the family, then the question was, well, I think I just decided I wanted to make it a first person rotating perspective among the family, because I really like rotating first person perspective stories. It's really fun. And obviously yours is an excellent example of that. I think one of the magic things about reading is you can kind of be transported into another consciousness. You get a chance to live a set of experiences through someone else's eyes. If it's done well, for a while you get to you're living somebody else's life. And for me, I think that a lot of the novels that I've loved the most that use the first person perspective, those consciousnesses never really leave me, right? They become a part of my life. And so I knew that I wanted to write in a rotating first person perspective. And then it was just a lot of work to figure out the voices, because I had to make them very, very different from myself and people I knew. I really didn't want to draw on anybody I knew or my own voice. So that took a lot of work to kind of invent the voices and make them feel valid and real.
Yeah, same for me, in the sense that I didn't want to base them on real people, but you want to base it on a reality that at the same time.
Yeah.
And you talk about, from a craft perspective, what was behind some of your choices around two things, because two things struck me the most, just from a craft perspective and a style perspective in their book. It's very voicey in a good way. Sometimes I hear voicey used in a bad way, but in a good way. It means like strong voices that I know very well. And the pacing is amazing. And there's a short chapter thing that you do where like you'll randomly move to another character and you're like, this one's going to be 3 pages. Get over it. And it works. It totally works. So can you talk about some of the decisions around craft decisions you made around voiciness, and then also these sort of pacing decisions around how you move prismatically through the lives of these characters? And all of a sudden you'll get 8 pages and then you'll get 2 pages. And, can you talk about craft decisions?
Yeah. And some of them I would have to look back through the book if I can recall them correctly, but certainly from a pacing perspective, I think the chapters get a little bit shorter as the book goes on. I think I made an effort to make the earlier chapters long enough that people could kind of settle into each character and feel kind of attuned to that character before I moved on to the next one. But as it goes on, and I kind of wanted to keep the plot moving at a good clip, and people were familiar with the characters and had kind of had their moment to orient to each character's world, then I could shift more quickly between them, which I think keeps things moving. And having short chapters is always nice, because if you're reading, you feel like you've accomplished something. It's always nice to be like, oh, I finished a chapter. I'm doing something with my life. So that part of it is nice as well. And I think as it goes on, the chapters get a little bit shorter, or at least certainly that was generally my intention. But crafting the voices was difficult for a lot of reasons, because it spans so much time in the characters' lives. And I tried to put a lot of effort into a couple of different things. One of those was to try and have the characters, so they're speaking, it's past tense in the early part, and then as it gets later in the book, it moves into present tense. And so when they're talking in the first parts of the book, it's in the past tense. And so they're able to have slightly more advanced understandings of where they're at. And then as it goes on, it moves into the present tense. And so that I had to kind of adjust the way that they were viewing the events to be ones where they didn't have any really retrospective approach to them in the later section. So that was one thing that went along with it. And then trying to figure out, like, in a given situation, or even when a character has a given thought, I had to spend a lot of time working through grammatical issues and syntax issues. Like, well, how would this sound differently for, a 15-year-old girl that is not as she doesn't have the same level of code switching that her older brother does, who really wants to sling around like slang and kind of drop into the local dialect. How are they going to phrase things differently, and how are their minds going to think of things differently? So there's like a lot of grammatical work and things like that. And one of the other challenges was that a couple of the characters they all have varying levels of pidgin that they use, and pidgin is that's the term for the Hawaiian patois, or like the local lingo that's used there. They have varying levels of that, and there's a way that you can render that so that it is most truthful sort of sonically. And I think if you grow up in Hawaii and you read literature that's local to the islands, people have a pretty standard way that they write it on the page. And that includes a lot of apostrophes, a lot of spellings that are kind of hard to at least for me as a reader, like visually on the page, it's hard to read. And so I spend a lot of time trying to find a good middle ground where I thought the words would still flow nicely on the page. And I find too much, like, if there are too many apostrophes and different marks on a page, it starts to break it up in my mind. And so I tried to find a way to make it feel smooth and still render at some level the right rhythm of the language. And that was really difficult as well. So there's a lot of work on a lot of levels.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
We were talking earlier about, before we were on live or whatever, we were in a virtual green room, you guys. So just so you know,
It's not
we were
as cool
talking
as it
about,
sounds.
it's just this. And
It's just
there
this
is a green border around the framing.
It's true. It's true.
We were talking about how, you know, there's certain readers that we've read in the canon where, you know, there's terms like, I don't know, boating terms in Moby Dick, and you just like, you read it and you get it or you don't, you look it up or you don't. A lot of times you can just keep moving past it. And there's a lot of, sometimes, you know, people think publishers ask you to over explain and you're compromised. And I don't know, I don't feel that that was the case in your situation. I feel you did it, you handled it in a way that didn't require that to even be a conversation. Is that true?
So there were certainly conversations about it. I think especially when it got to the copy editing level, right? Because then the people that are doing the copy editing are literally like, I look at each sentence and I try to make it the like purest version of the sentence it can be, which is, it's great because people like at the copy editing phase, you always really learn how bad of a writer you are, because somebody's like, you can't use like this, you're using like an intransitive verb. What are you doing? And you're like,
yeah.
I thought I was a good writer. Now I realize I have no idea what I'm doing.
I think after like 5 or 6 books, you can then fight the copy editors. But at first you're like, you're right. I don't know.
Yeah. But there was some sections, you know, there was a little bit of back and forth on some of those things. And there were times where they were like, is this really what you meant to write? And I was like, yes, that is really what I meant to write. And you have to leave it, because especially for people that are familiar with the dialect, when it got into some of the more syntactic elements of Pidgin, if you're from the islands, you were just like, yeah, man, that's the way it sounds. And if you're not, then you're like, what is this? So, you know, I tried to strike a middle ground, and there were some cases where I was like, yeah, it's clear. Well, you are right that there's more clarity if we structure it that other way. So we're gonna do it that way for this sentence, but this other sentence, we're not gonna do it that way. You know, so I had to kind of try and strike a middle ground at that level.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, and then when it came to things like slang and a lot of there are a lot of loan words in there, right? From multiple languages, from Filipino, from Japanese, from Chinese, and from Olelo Hawaii, which is the native language of Hawaii. And like if you grow up in the islands, that's all just there. It's part of it's just part of the way you talk with other people, and everybody kind of gathers up these loan words from different languages. And a lot of that stuff was in there. And I think that at one point there was kind of a question of like, should this be in italics and things like that? And I was very much like, no, it can't be in italics, because that draws attention to it and suggests it's a foreign word at some level. And these are not foreign words. If you grow up in the islands and you know, somebody uses a term like okole, or they use like basura, which is like, I know that's kind of even an adoption of both the Spanish and the Portuguese word for like trash, but you could say somebody's like garbage, or they're doing garbage work by using like basura. So there's all these words like that, and they're just part of like the way people talk to each other. They're not foreign words. And so there were times when there was sort of a back and forth about like, well, I couldn't tell that this wasn't, you know, this was I thought this was a typo because it's not a word that I'm familiar with. But I'm like, yeah, but these characters are familiar with it. So there was a give and take on some of that.
Well, even more so because it's first person, like on a realism level, this is how people would be thinking or talking. They would be using terms and there'd be no explanation. If you had third person, you may have to like explain why you're not explaining or whatever. Right. So speaking of sort of this middle ground and copy editor and, you know, who eventually reads this, did you have an audience in mind in terms of the way you think when you're writing and when you're revising? Do you think of the general reader? Do you think of a community that would realistically actually end up reading your work? Do you think of, who do you think of, or who did you think of?
It's gonna make me sound like a sociopath and like an egomaniac, but just myself, essentially, right? And I was like,
no, a sociopath would be like the entire world.
Yeah, no, I think that I'm not sure if it was Toni Morrison that said this, and I would hate to misquote her because she's obviously such an amazing literary force, just like a lioness of American letters and just world literature in general. But if it wasn't her, I'm not sure who it was, but they had basically said, like, well, if you don't see the book that you want, like, write the book that you want. And I think that was really where I was operating from. I didn't know if anybody was going to read it. I kind of didn't know why I was writing it. I still sometimes don't know why I write, except that I read things that I love and that move me and that kind of imprint themselves on my consciousness and never leave. And I want to do that, right? And so when I was writing this, I just wanted to kind of find some way to create the magic that I experience as a reader, and just try to do it. I don't even know why, because there are plenty of books in the world, but I think that I was operating from the perspective of, well, if there were a book that I wanted to read that I haven't read, what would it be like? And that was sort of what I wrote from. And I wrote that knowing that I know that my tastes are not so esoteric that there wouldn't be anybody else that would want to read it. I didn't know how many people or who, but I was like, well, my tastes there are people that have similar tastes to me that would probably enjoy reading something that I also enjoyed reading. So I'll just shoot generally for that. But I think it can be paralyzing, or it's too hard to calculate that sort of thing, I think, as a writer, to say, well, I'm going to try and write for this specific audience. And I take that back now. I think that some people can do that effectively. I just can't do that effectively. I think that it leads to too much second guessing of myself. And I don't think I'd be able to really write as freely as I would want to if I was worried about, targeting one specific audience.
Now, in terms of that, what you were saying about, there are tons of books out there, sure. And like, what would be a book that you would want to see in the world? There certainly aren't a lot of well-known books about Hawaii or anything related to it. I can name very few. There's This Is Paradise, the short story collection, is amazing. She teaches at the school that I teach at.
Yeah, so good. Such a good collection.
But there's not very many other works that are well known. So as a reader and as a writer, aspiring writer, before you started writing the book, did you feel, or when you started writing the book, did you feel you were writing into a vacuum? Did you feel that you needed to honor certain literary traditions that existed that other people don't know about? Like, what don't we know about this whole world? Because I know there's an indigenous world that also includes your experience, but there's also specific sectors within that that reservation writing versus urban Indian writing. Like, there were different things that came into my thinking around what was there, what wasn't. So could you talk about that?
Yeah. So there have been writers over the years from Hawaii that have written, similar to myself, that have written from the perspective of the islands, with that as sort of the central concern, not necessarily coming to the islands as an outsider, or trying to look at them as, I don't know, you could have a lot of situations where the story is arriving at the islands from someplace externally and orienting yourself to the islands, and that sort of writing. And there are several writers over the years that have done that, have written from the islands, I would say kind of for the islands. And I talked about a few of those in the acknowledgements, and certainly, Lois Ann Yamanaka was one of the first writers I encountered. She was, I think she published her first books either in the really late 70s or the early 80s. And she was the first person who I just found one of her books at the public library, or maybe we read one in school when I was in secondary school. And all of a sudden it was like full on Pidgin, people living out in like the rural parts of Hawaii that has nothing to do with like beach resorts or vacations or any of that stuff. And I remember being really struck by that, because it felt like the most recognizable version of Hawaii I'd ever encountered. And so she was the first writer that I encountered that had done that. She's written a lot of books, from Saturday Night at the Pahala Theater to Wild Meat and the Bully Burgers, and she's had a bunch of novels like Blues Hanging and things like that. That she is published by FSG, and I think that she had made some waves. Like she got like, you know, Annie Proulx like blurb on one of her covers, so she's certainly like established herself. There's also Keanu Davenport, who wrote is it a trilogy or 4 books? It starts with Shark Dialogues as the first book, and there are several others that follow after that. And she also writes very much from the perspective of the islands, very strong anti-colonial elements in her work. She really works to kind of overturn some of the colonial sort of traditions that have imprinted themselves on the islands. There's a lot of others. You mentioned Christiana Kahakawila. There's tons of writers that are there, but they just don't necessarily break through at the national scene. So I definitely kept their writing in mind and wanted to write in a way that felt like it recognized their work and was in a conversation with it. And I also found their work, as some of them, you know, started out when there were so many less avenues and I think places for them to go to get that work on a national stage. And so I definitely wrote from recognizing they had opened doors that hadn't been opened previously. And that was excellent as well. So.
Were you a reader as a kid?
I was, yeah. I can't remember not reading. And it was what I used to, I guess anytime I was in a space that didn't feel comfortable or safe, I think my first response is to read. That was certainly how I was when I was a little kid. I can think of a lot of situations in which I would find a book and go sit in a corner at a party or something like that when I was like 12, and you know, my parents had people over at the house or whatever. So it looks like we lost you, Tommy. I think your connection might have died.
Am I frozen or am I just an icon?
You're an icon. You're a giant space invader.
I'd rather be an icon than frozen in some
cool. Yeah, we're good.
Am I still an icon?
You are. You're still an icon. It's kind of.
I'm going to try to refresh. Just pause. Maybe ask the audience a question about the questions they're going to ask to maybe inspire deeper questions. While I'm going to disappear for a second. Unless you just want to talk to them, you can just monologue if you want.
I could. No, I'm not cool.
I'm going to leave for a second.
All right. Yeah, let me see. So I'll scroll down and just look at some of the Q&A that's here to sort of work through it. So I can see the top question was already answered. We got 4 votes for this question about, you know, can you tell me about the title, how you chose it and where it came from? This is actually kind of a funny question because I went back and forth among a whole set of different titles. I wanted to figure out a way to kind of tie together some of the thematic elements that are at a higher level. So things related to, you know, faith and heritage and tradition, while also finding a way to kind of hope the imagery or what was in the title could point to the islands at some level in a non-stereotypical way. So I wanted to avoid anything about paradise or flowers or some of the like very standard images of the islands. And so I was trying to figure out a way to have a shark be part of the title, because obviously the sharks factor in very heavily in the book, but they're also a powerful image. And I also, again, wanted to speak to some elements of faith and heritage at the same time, and that's where the savior part came from. I played around with a bunch of different titles, and I swear the entire publishing process, I kept telling everybody, look, if you guys don't like this title, we can pick another title. Somebody better than me can probably figure out a shorter title, one that's like cooler. I was very self-conscious of the title the whole way through, but people just kept ignoring me. I was like, do you want to change the title? And they would just not respond to my email. So I finally just gave up, and I was like, all right, well, here it is. So
am I back?
Yeah, you're a space invader again. But
oh, I'm still an icon?
Yeah, I mean, you are an icon, but you're also a space invader.
Okay, one more question. If I'm not coming back, maybe other people see me. Maybe it's just you that doesn't see me.
Maybe so.
We don't know that. Yeah. One more question before I move on to the questions that people are asking. And this is a little bit selfish of me because the reading muscles in my brain, they have totally just, they're out of shape, and they're not, because I'm reading so much news and so worried and anxious, I'm unable to get them back into shape because I pick up something and then I'm just sort of, anyway, but I don't believe this is the right way to be. And you said something earlier before in the green room, just about maybe sort of reaching a level of information saturation where it becomes useless to keep reading stuff. So I think there's a good argument to be made, and I think you should make it just briefly before we move on to questions, for reading fiction right now. I think it's a really good time to read fiction, and I am going to actively try to do it more because it's way, to me it's way more productive and valuable an experience than like consuming a massive amount of information about something you feel helpless about with an insane tyrant monster at the helm doing whatever. So
yeah, there's a couple different ways I approach it. One of the things that continues to remind me of just like the pure joy and magic of reading is reading with my daughters. Like I love reading books with them that really just transport you into a totally different world where there are like talking animals and magic. And I know that some of those books are compromised and problematic and not perfect when we look at the cultural, the awakening that has happened today. Sometimes you can read some of these things and you're like, there's some issues of like sexism and some weird, undertones that we should probably deal with in some of these older books. And yet you can still find ways to enjoy some of those books. And, so there are a lot of just fun kids books that I've been reading, whether it's something like a Roald Dahl book or some of the shorter poems that are in some of the children's collections that we have at home that we read our daughters to. And those things help remind me just of the way that literature can just be very joyful and playful. And there's always space for joy and play, no matter how serious things get. And I think there was an article not an article, I guess an essay that Rebecca Mackay wrote, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing her last name. I've never met her, so I don't actually know how to pronounce her last name. But she wrote it, I think, last year or the year before in Electric Literature, and she was talking about, basically that same question, like what's the point of writing and reading when the world feels like it's on fire? And she was like, people have always done that, right? She gave these great examples of people that were in cells, prison cells, that were on lockdown, that were, learning poetry and remembering it in their heads, or people that were in like the, communist Russia that were essentially on house arrest, that would write poems on their paper and then show it to people that would come to their house and then eat the paper. So there was no evidence that they had written that poetry. And that art just endures in all these time periods and can always be found as valuable. I think the Curious George, like H.A. Ray and I think Margaret Way, I think that's the name of the couple, they fled the Nazi advance into France on a bicycle that they had built by hand, and they carried the first Curious George manuscript with them, right? And this is just a Curious George, but they carried that book with them through World War II until they arrived in the United States. And so there's always a space for art and joy, just simple joy to be had, even in the hardest times. I would say those are the times when it's the most important. So one of the other things I do is I use the Poetry Foundation has a great app and a podcast. Actually, they have a podcast. And every morning I try to listen to a poem read out loud on through the poetry.org podcast. It's such a nice way to start the day. I come into my room and the lights are still off and it's really early in the morning, and I just listen in the darkness to a poem that somebody's reading, and it's a very lovely way to be. So I don't know if I answered your question perfectly, but those are the way I think about reading right now.
No, that's great. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say, just before I go to questions, that your book is definitely one that should be read right now. It's totally engrossing, unputdownable, has an urgency, and is beautiful. And it's not just about being transported. I don't think this is a time for escapism. This is a time to read stuff that has depth to it. And this is, ultimately a book about family and what it means to love each other and go through stuff that hurts and believe in magic and then not believe in it. It's a beautiful book. So I'm going to go to questions. Okay, I don't know if I can tell. I think you answered some while I was gone for a second, maybe one or two.
Yeah, there were two that had been, the second one there has been answered, and somebody had asked about what Hawaiian authors had influenced my writing. And then there was another one about the title. Somebody kind of wanted to know about the title.
I don't know if this is how relevant this is, but I think we can answer it pretty quickly. And maybe we already did. Somebody's asking, curious about what interaction the two of us have had before now.
Yeah.
Have we crossed paths before?
No, right. This is the first time. I mean, certainly I will say that I was in like the revision stage with, I think that my novel was finished and we were just sort of sending it out to people when your novel, when There was really, really starting to get the attention it deserved and was really out in the public consciousness in a really good way. And it gave me a little bit more, it felt good because I felt like there were things that was happening in both of our works. And so even though we haven't met each other, this is the first time I've met Tommy, his work has certainly been an influence on me. It was something that kind of helped me feel a little bit better about the novel, my novel as it went out into the world, because I felt it felt like they were in conversation at some level. And so I was like, okay, someone else is feeling some of the same things I'm feeling and they're writing about it too. And so even though he and I hadn't met, I felt at some level like we were thinking some of the same things. So that was kind of cool. And it's really awesome that we're getting to do this event tonight. It's too bad it's not in person, but it's,
Yeah, and for my next novel, I feel like my next novel is sort of in conversation with Sharks in the Time of Saviors.
Oh, cool.
I feel like it did stuff to me that changed the way I thought about forming my next novel. So somebody's asking, I just finished the audiobook and love the actors. How involved were you in that production and selection of the cast?
Yeah, so the audiobook publisher, I think, has it named, like their name is Recorded Books, I think. Maybe I'm getting their name wrong. The people that were involved in the production of the book did such a good job choosing the actors, and they, at the very end, they were sort of like, well, here's who we're thinking about using, take a listen. And I was just blown away by the selections they made. I had nothing to say. I was just sort of like, this is, you found actors that really understand the islands, and that I think I looked at the bios for some of the actors, and a lot of them had some connection to Hawaii if they weren't necessarily originally from there. I think most of them were from the Pacific Islands and things like that. But I didn't have any real control or say in that for the most part, but the audiobook publisher did such a great job. And seeing that they're such talented voice actors, and it was my first real encounter with voice actors, and they're just incredible to listen to. I was like, wow, this is quite an art, and one that I would be terrible at. I'm so glad I didn't end up having to read the audiobook. I would have done such a worse job than these really talented voice actors. So I was very excited with hearing some of the finished work they'd done.
I'm in the middle of listening to it now, and I think it's, I obviously read the book first before there was an audio version.
Yeah.
But the audio version is fantastic. I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah.
Somebody's asking, I believe you have described yourself as an environmental activist. How has that informed your literary work, or do you think it has?
Yeah, very much so, and that increases over time. I grew up in Hawaii. That was where I was born and raised, and some of the most meaningful experiences and informative experiences of my youth were in these incredible outdoor spaces that were in many ways sort of wild and untamed. They were sort of off the beaten path on kind of like hidden parts of the islands that locals will know about and you can kind of trek to, but they're inconvenient enough and not publicized enough that you can still access spaces that feel very much off the beaten path. And whether that's someplace that I was surfing or even just skin diving in the ocean without any sort of breathing equipment, or some of the hikes and valleys and mountains in the islands, I just have this this incredible fondness and connection to the natural world. And that comes through in this book, certainly, because I think some of the themes speak toward the relationship between people and the land and what I consider important about that. And I also sort of, put questions to the ways in which the islands have been compromised by more, capitalist endeavors. And all the writing I do now, I really take it to the central question of how I can talk about even more about the environment and how important it is to me. And really, I think the thing that I'm focusing on now in the novel I'm working on is a sense of optimism. I really enjoy the opportunity to try and imagine a better world than the one we have, and to try and have that be something that shows up in the current novel I'm working on. And I want people to be able to both recognize the grandeur of the natural world and also feel hopeful about the fact that we can still make the world a better place, and a place where we have a stronger connection to the natural world. This is something that I think that a majority of indigenous cultures understood, because they depended on a strong relationship with the natural world in order to survive. If you didn't understand, tidal shifts and when it was best and worst to catch fish, or how to manage a fishery, or how to plant your crops in a way that allowed them to be sustainable, then you didn't survive. And so it's one of many things that indigenous cultures valued and understood, that I think we could all learn a lot from. And that shows up in the novel as well.
Okay, we only have one more question, and I may ask one last one before we have a sort of a closing statement from Politics and Prose. If you don't see, I'm going to answer this one first because mine is short. Bye. If you don't see the book you want on the shelf, write it. Beverly Cleary said that. Kawai and Tommy, what were your favorite books as a child, teen, and/or young adult? I'm answering first because I was not a reader, so I have none. Zero. There's nothing.
Yeah, so one of the ones that I always think of, and I think it's one of those questions where if people were like, well, what's on your bookshelf that would surprise other people? There is a graphic novel series called Elf Quest that was written by a husband-wife duo, Wendy Peeney and Richard Peeney. I think the majority of the creative control actually fell on Wendy Peeney. And I remember reading that probably earlier than I should have, because there are actually these really complex sexual situations that turn up, and there's like wars that happen in it, where there are images of people, being impaled on spears and stuff like that. And I think I read it when I was in like 5th grade or something, so I think I might have been a little bit young. But that was one of the first books I can remember really loving, just being totally absorbed. And it's a graphic novel series. There were shorter works, and then they got kind of combined into a few anthologies. It's also one of the first books I can remember reading that had characters from a variety of like ethnic backgrounds. And so there were different groups that had these different physical features in which I could kind of place myself. I could see some characters and be like, that character looks like me and feels like people I know. And I think that made it really powerful for me as well. And then when I got a little bit older, I read a lot of science fiction, and some of it was good and some of it was bad. But another one that I can remember being very influential was Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. And I think if you're like, I don't know, if you're like a young boy in particular that feels kind of ostracized and also feels a little bit smart, then the main character Ender in that book, I think there's a lot of, you can feel sort of a certain amount of identification with him. And so I read that when I was, I don't know, maybe 7th grade or something. I remember that being really influential. And I think some of the books I spoke to earlier, like Lois Ann Yamanaka's work, that was the work I encountered when I was a little bit older. That was also very influential. And there are plenty of other authors as well.
So before we go to close via the Politics and Prose people, if you're comfortable sharing what is next, and maybe just a brief thought on like, what are your hopes given the context? Your book should be getting all the attention it deserves in a normal world, but we don't have that. So what are your hopes for that, and what is next?
Yeah, so the world is what it is. And I think that resenting any sort of situation that is beyond your control it just leads to dissatisfaction. And that's really true for just about any situation, right? You enter a place where you have certain expectations or desires for the outcome of a given situation, and more often than not, that's not the way things go. And one of the ways that you can really make yourself unhappy is to hold on to that alternate version of the world that you either wish was there or that it was too late to make happen. And you spend a lot of time dealing with frustration and regret and things like that. And man, like life is so short. I just want to be as happy as I can be in any given situation. And I think that one of the ways you can do that is to really let go of those notions of like, I want things to be different than they are. to the extent that you don't have any control over that, then you have to just let it go. And the things you can control are the things that you have to focus on. And that's certainly what I'm trying to do right now. And that has a lot less to do with my book, honestly, than it does with trying to reach out to some of my neighbors that are elderly and that I'm concerned might be in compromised situations if they have to go to the grocery store, or, all the local like booksellers and people that work in restaurants and people that work in industries that have just seen these massive layoffs all of a sudden. I spend a lot of time donating to food banks and trying to figure out places I can volunteer to support work for relief in the community. And those are things I can do right now that can make a difference. Beyond that, like, my book's landing when it's landing, and it finds its readers or it doesn't. And I try not to spend, it feels weird to spend any time promoting it. So I have to strike this middle ground where I feel kind of gross talking about my book and being like, oh, you should read my book, when people are like, but there's a global pandemic. I don't really want to read your book. I want to be safe and happy. And so I try not to, spend too much time talking about my book, but I also have faith that it'll
does have a strong chance to make people feel happy.
Sometimes I'm like, if now's the time to read, you're certainly stuck at home, you can enjoy my book. It's going to take you to a totally different world than the world you're in right now, which is nice as well, so there's that side of it. Anyway, in terms of what I'm working on now, I have a new novel, and it deals with, there are some elements of like reincarnation, and it spans about 200 years. It looks at ancient Hawaii, and it has a whole bunch of it that's set in the future, kind of post climate change in like the late 21st century. And I get to imagine all these cool interactions between the two time periods through reincarnation and stuff. And
so you did decide to simplify it in the end. You did decide to simplify it in the end, huh?
Well, it's at least in third person. So there's not a bunch of different voices I have to construct. So I can only focus on one voice. So there's that.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts, and for reading, and for your book, most of all.
Thank you. Thank you, Tommy. I never imagined that I would be in a situation where you and I would be discussing my book. I just thought my book would fade away, and I'm such a great, fan of your work, and I'm so excited to see what you produce next. And I'm going to be right there. I'll be the first in line to buy a copy. I'm excited. I'm so glad to see work like yours out in the world. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Kawai Strong Washburn, so amazing. And Tommy Orange, even though we lost your video for a bit, you guys were just so fantastic to listen to, and it was great having you both on the screen. I just want to say, Toni Morrison did say, if there's a book you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must read it. So you're right there. Yeah, Tony. Thank you both. You can purchase Kawai's book on that button right there. It will take you straight to Politics and Prose, and we will ship it to you. That's right. Yeah, you can get one of these in your hands. So thank you both so much. Thank you all for your support. It's what's keeping us going at a time like this. So we really need that to help, just keep us going, get our doors back open, and you can also click the follow button right up top next to the Politics and Prose button, and you can see what's coming up next. On Friday, on the 3rd at 7 p.m., Melissa Clark is with us for dinner in French, and on Saturday at 3 p.m. is Honor Moore with Our Revolution. So please join us for that, and a whole lineup of events coming up. Kawai, Tommy, thank you so much. It's been fantastic, and we're looking forward to getting you both in the store when your books come out. So
yeah, I look forward to the day where we can meet in person. That day will come, and it will be a very nice day.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all,
and
and everyone, stay well read.